the question period?
Sure.
Okay.
That's fine.
I want to use the mic for the questions for the sake of our webcasting, if that's all right. So who'd like to start out with our first question? Who'd like to do the second then? Yeah, here we go.
I wanted to ask, in the contemporary university, those that you know, what are examples of not a liberal arts education?
Oh, I mean, there are many. So when I think about education in this country, I try to think about the whole structure. So not just universities, but colleges, so there's difference there, but then also community colleges, and then the relationship amongst all of those to education, K through 12. And so the short answer is that, I guess probably two pieces. The community college system is at this point educating more of us than any other part of our educational system, and the liberal arts are in very uneven ways represented within that system. And then the second piece of the answer would be that within universities, I think there's a great degree of difference in terms of how much reading of books is asked of students. And that depends a lot, I think, on the shape of curricular requirements in different places. So you've got, my stepson has just started at Reed College, which I now take to be, at one extreme in terms of the amount of reading that it requires of students. And then places like the University of Chicago and Columbia are also unusual and still requiring students to begin their education with an array of books as opposed to articles and facts and so forth about contemporary circumstances, books from other periods. But I think it's also possible to move through some universities without reading much that was written prior to the last 10 years. And again, you heard from my argument that I don't advocate thinking about liberal arts in terms of a canon, but I do advocate thinking in terms of big and hard books, and I think they can come from all over, and I think an education can consist of those in quite different ways. That is, what's read can be quite different from case to case, but there still is a kind of book that is worth reading and should be read.
I heard in your defense of liberal arts education a stirring defense of liberalism itself in general. And I think the hardest question for someone who believes in adaptability is how to deal with others who believe in cultural replication. How people who are infused with the liberal ideal deal with illiberal societies, illiberal people within their own society. Could you address that within the context of education?
Well, the short of it is that I see every conversation as an opportunity for education for both parties or for all the parties participating in it. So I don't take schools with walls to be the limit of where education can happen. So in that regard, I think that somebody with commitments like mine needs, when encountering people without those commitments, to be able to engage them in conversation and talk productively with them in the hopes of trying to persuade. So I am somebody who believes in persuasion as an activity, although I think persuasion always as the act of a friend. And so it's an activity that has to be bound by constraints of respect for where the other person is beginning in the conversation, and with the expectation, too, that one might learn from them. So the short answer is that I think more can be done in conversation than we presently do. That doesn't mean that there aren't limits. Sometimes there simply are limits, and that's a fact of conversation. It doesn't in any way reduce the value of pursuing the conversations to the degree that it's possible to pursue them.
I've been an educator, and however my information is kind of local and provincial. But I have this impression that the liberal arts education is very small and very rare when you take the country, our country as a whole. And my opinion is the ideal would be to start in kindergarten. But my question is, well, two parts. How do you get it going kind of across the board? And see, I forgot the second part. Well, go
So
ahead.
I jump in, and then if
Yeah.
it occurs to you, you can
Yeah.
offer the second part. Well, let's see. There's a practical answer to your question, which is that I am a person who acts as an educator in a variety of different contexts. So I've taught in universities. I serve on a board for public K through 12 public schools, charter public schools in Chicago. I also have participated in various adult education programs. And so I consider it part of my role as a practical person in the world to advocate for forms of education that have that content in them. At the end of the day, I don't think one can ever disseminate an idea without there being soldiers on the ground doing the work of advocating for that idea. So I don't think that there's a kind of magic policy bullet that can be used. And I mean, maybe the other thing I would say about that point is just, as I see it, one of the very hard things about talking about education in this country right now is that our whole system has, over the last 50 years, but in an accelerating way, been going through a transition from intense localism to a sense of national structure for it, national standards and things like that. But of course, the fights over desegregation in the 50s introduced federal intervention in local education, right? And so for us, I think we're all a little confused about what can be done locally, what needs to be done nationally. And I think in some sense, the first thing we need to do is think through that question. What's won, what's lost in that transition? And where does localism work better? Where do you need national efforts, which might have a kind of single policy change that felt like a silver bullet in some sort of way? But the short of it is, I right now try to do local things. So, like you, I believe in local knowledge about these things.
Well, that's just all I have. The other part of my question having to do with we as a liberal arts educated small minority of the country, maybe it's a problem with my communication skills, but how do we convince other people or enter into what you spoke about,
Right.
persuasive discussions, as you said, you assume is with a friend, and I have found out it's not with a friend.
Fair enough.
How can we work with that as a mission, as individuals, or as a group?
Thank you, that's very helpful. I mean, I suppose that's a good moment for me to say that's exactly where the fake it till you make it idea kind of applies. When it doesn't feel like talking to a friend, you just keep, acting as if you're in a conversation with a friend, and that helps to start to bring something into existence, I think. But, so, I mean, what I've tried to do is point out two things to people. One about, and to some extent this is a historical accident, but it is the case that a huge number of the leaders, political leaders in this country, have had a liberal arts education. And so although liberal arts education is reserved for a small number of people in the present moment, and getting smaller, right? Has everybody noticed this fact? Not because of a change in the level of commitment, but because this country's population has doubled in size since the 1950s. But, it's not the case that all of the country's liberal arts colleges have doubled the size of the number of students that they admit. So it's a more elite segment who get an education in liberal arts college now than 50 years ago even. But anyway, what I try to do is call people's attention to some of the practical facts about who has had this education and what it has meant for them in terms of their life and what sorts of possibilities it opens up for people. But then I mean, this idea of the memo is something I actually try to make something of, in the sense that if you really look around the world at any organization, the folks who are in the leadership positions are people who have to work in language. And at the end of the day, I mean, that is what a liberal arts education focuses on in distinction from other kinds of educations. So then one asks, well, but how is that not just an education in, say, communication or language or something like that, or writing? And the answer there is part of what I was trying to point to in those Prince memos. I mean, there is a worldview in there. There is a set of ideas about how to be part of a community. Are they thin ideas in his memo, or are they worthwhile ideas? You know, that's a question we should ask. And in order to learn how to develop rich ideas as part of writing, that's where liberal arts education is distinctive from just an education in writing. So, my answers are getting a little long. I apologize. So.
Toward the end of your talk, you talked about the Socratic method of education and sort of throwing off inherited ideas, and talked about why society shouldn't necessarily be afraid of that and how it could go ahead and embrace that. And you mentioned a few benefits to society of that type of philosophy. I didn't hear you say anything about the benefit to the individuals and just the simple benefit of being able to exercise their own judgment, choose their own means, exercise their own freedom of choice. And to me, the purpose of, to me, the benefit is to the individual, and subordinating society to the individual, to me, is one of the defining elements of Western civilization itself. And I was wondering if you'd have any comments on the role of the individual in your presentation or in your approach.
No, thank you. I must apologize then, because I concluded with remarks about society because I thought that I had spent so much time talking about the individual and I wanted to bring society in, but that means I didn't say all that I needed to say. So yes, the education in the first instance does provide the opportunity for the individual to develop as a free human being. So the question, I think, the hard question you're asking me is, what's it worth to be a free human being? And is it just, as you put it, freedom of choice, or is it a richer idea than that? And I did not say, so that's true, that I am taking our capacity to be self-governing in this way as one of the things that is richest about us. And I am taking this idea of freedom in the rich sense then of becoming a person who's self-governing. So that means that, it's not that it's a sort of freedom of choice in a haphazard way, but that one comes to have a richly worked and earned set of commitments. And in their status as richly worked and earned, they have all the other elements of value that I think you're alluding to in terms of accessing or making space for one's sense of human worth, realizing human potential, and things like that. So I don't know if that addressed the whole that you spotted or not. But
I believe it did. Thank you.
okay.
Your lecture was brilliant and a little bit sad.
Oh dear.
And without hurting your feelings, you made a statement that at present you are concentrating on local issues, and having had the experience of witnessing what's happening in the K-12 and then extrapolating that data to college life, my question to you is, do you see anything wrong in having a national core curriculum for both undergraduate, but starting with a K-12? Because what I heard from you was that that battle is lost, and now we are going to concentrate on local issues.
I see. Okay. No, I probably need to try to clarify what I was saying a little bit. I probably would not be in favor of a national curriculum. There are a few reasons for that. Let me just give you one. And this is something I've only recently started to think, so I'm not sure yet entirely what I think here. But anyway, for the present moment, the question of evolution, for example, has become a political question. It has become a political question, I believe, because we now have a question about a national curriculum. If we weren't having a conversation about national curriculum, we wouldn't need to fight over it politically. The conversation about evolution could happen in intellectual contexts. Okay, so that's one of the things I was suggesting when I was saying there are some losses that come with having a national idea. You have to fight over it politically, and then it ain't intellectual anymore. And when it's not that, you've lost what it was about in the first place. So
Sorry, a few comments and then a question. First of all, I must admit I found your comment about the memo rather intriguing. In my career, I always use the example of the scribe at the foot of the Pharaoh. Not apparently much power, but what we do know about the Middle Kingdom is essentially what the scribes chose to write. The Pharaoh may or may not have said it, but ultimately what we do know 5,000 years later, and it was not exactly an elected official either.
Right.
So it puts some political aspects in perspective. One wonders actually who redacts the whatever the discussions in Congress are. So actually who essentially leaves the legacy of our political system. Brilliant lecture, I must admit, very thought-provoking. But I see an obvious corollary to your statement. In essence, I think you aptly mentioned that the percentage of people interested in liberal arts, just numerically, is half of what it was 50 years ago. And I think I'm being an optimist, probably.
Right, but I would say interested in, but who get that lucky
yes.
education.
However, having spent 20 years in engineering, I can tell you that it is precisely the other 90+% who badly need it
Right.
in order to be able to communicate.
Right.
I don't know if you bothered to read any user manual of any technical device.
Oh, no. Yes, I'm sorry, this is one of my pet peeves.
So, quod erat
actually.
demonstrandum.
Right,
So now we're getting to, I think, the gist of it.
right.
You have been preaching to the choir. This
Right.
is a university of 50,000 students, and I don't think we see about 45,000
Right.
here.
Right.
So it's a self-selected group. So the categorical imperative is actually to impart precisely the point of this liberal education, to free one's mind and to question to exactly the ones who, unfortunately, having spent engineering and all of that, are bombarded with facts, factoids, labs, very necessary, but probably more akin to a vocational school.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we reconcile this? Because I think we are reaching, to some extent, a point of crisis. We may have under one roof, conceptually, of a huge university, whether Princeton or University of Texas at Austin, tribes that cannot communicate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for another hard and important question. I have to make an aside, which is that your comment about user manuals makes me realize that health insurance information booklets are even worse than user manuals. Okay?
Yeah.
Right, no, that's true. Exactly. But at any rate, so your two questions side by side are in fact very helpful, because whereas I don't think that there should be a nationally established curriculum or standards, I do think universities need to have these conversations. And so I do think there is room for leadership within universities to open up the question of what an education is and what it's for. And there are different ways of doing that, and those are hard conversations to have. So they need to be had with sort of delicacy and subtlety. But at any rate, and the conversations need to be among students, they need to be among faculty, and then I think they also need to be among employers, to be honest, because I think these days employers drive a lot of what young people think they want. And so if within, say, the business community it were possible to generate a conversation that was about wanting a different kind of student, a thinking kind of student, I think that would help a lot. I'm on the board of Amherst College, and Amherst has been going through a lot of intense conversations about its curriculum, and it's changing its curriculum. And one of the things that I've learned from those conversations is how important it has been there to really make sure that each constituency is having its conversation with itself, so that the students are talking too about what it is they think they need as educated people. And I think once people are engaged in that conversation, I think they start seeing things. So the other 95% of the engineers start saying, yes, actually, okay, I do feel the absence of this. I don't feel that I can get away with focusing on the liberal arts, but maybe if there were some way of building some piece of it into what I'm doing, I think one finds more uptake for that than it might seem at the front end. So, but it has to be conversational, I think, in an important way. And I think that's got something to do with the fact that education is, it's a deeply personal enterprise at the end of the day. So,
I think that the gentleman who asked the question, pointing out the affinities to contemporary liberalism in your vision of the liberal arts, was on track, and I wanted to push you on this point, because I think there's a lot of tension between the more modern conception of freedom, of sort of having an open mind and always being critical and always being willing to drop your beliefs and revise them. There's a deep tension between that conception of freedom and the earlier classical or medieval conception that informs the whole notion of the liberal arts, which says that being self-critical, having an open mind and being reflective is important, but it's important because it's the best way to come to knowledge of the truth, objectively conceived. And liberal pursuits are those that are intrinsically worth doing, whereas the servile arts are the ones that are, done for the sake of some other end. And if you have that affinities with that older conception of the liberal arts, I don't quite see how that squares with the more modern one. And it seems to me that anyone who's involved in education is just sort of saddled with the older conception, because you're going to have to be making decisions about which good big books people read and which ones they don't. And canon is a dirty word, but you're going to have a criterion in light of which you decide which books you read and which ones you don't. And if that's not sort of, truth or beauty or goodness or something like that, then I don't know what it would be. So maybe you can respond to that.
Sure. No, thank you. I have to say in the first instance that you've somewhat overread or overstated what my argument was. Okay, so it wasn't the recognizable keep an open mind, constantly revise your belief. It was earn your beliefs. Okay, there's an important difference in that, because it does mean that one will come to beliefs that one's not willing to give up, or at least not after. At least it takes as much work to give them up as it took to get to them in the first place. Okay. So then, what about truth? What kind of beliefs are those? So I describe them as being beliefs that are answers to the question of what's good, what's bad, what's fair, what's shameful, and so forth. Okay. Any person who comes to an answer to that has found what they take to be the truth. Okay. So yes, in that regard, it is an education in pursuit of the truth. I am not willing to say, however, that I can tell you now what the full truth is. I work every day to come up with what I believe the truth to be, okay? But I have humility about that, and I'm not sure I'm right. And I expect others to also recognize and to partake in, essentially, that humility, because we should know that the odds of our being wrong are great, and human history is full of examples of that. So then, in terms of criteria for books to select in canons, I absolutely refuse that category simply because there are too many good books for any of us to read in a lifetime. And I will not foreclose from anybody the opportunity to read those books. So I will say, here is the one I can help you with, and here's why I think it's a good book. But you go look for the ones that will be the right ones for you and that will help you answer hard questions. Because I haven't read everything. And until you've read everything, you can't actually pick the final pick. That's what a canon is. Sorry, I get a little exercise about that one. So. I could turn your question a different way if you'd like. There's a different version of canon, which is the original meaning of the word, which is just measure. Okay? And that is, apply a measure to something and judge it. And we should all do that with every book we read. But that's a different thing from coming up with a list. That's what I said, criterion. There's not just one criterion, that's all. I mean, that's, again, I'm happy to sit down and talk with you about books and tell you why I think some are better than others and which one I think you should read next, given what you've already read. But it has to start there.
I want to go back to this user manual question. In my experience, the folks that are writing the user manuals, those are the liberal arts majors. The problem is that they have no subject matter expertise, and so there's a huge gap between the folks with the subject matter expertise and the folks who are writing the user manuals. The problem is, how do you, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a technical person, whether you're whatever, you've got to go through so much time and training to get that level of expertise. And someone who's a liberal arts major simply doesn't have that time to do that. How do you resolve that dichotomy? How do you get how do you create this Renaissance person that can do everything and still there be 24 hours in a day.
You've just answered your question, actually, in some sense. That is to say, that means the people with the subject expertise need, for the purpose, a very practical purpose, need to have this other part of their education, right? And if one can articulate that other purpose effectively, one can make progress with it. And actually, as it happens, I don't know if you guys know who Charles Simoni is. I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly or not. But so he's the fellow who invented Microsoft Word and worked with Bill Gates. As it happens, he's working on exactly this issue right now, which is to try to figure out how to bring subject expertise together with, in his case, computer programming skills for similar reasons. But I suddenly realized that there is perhaps room for a conversation about what it means to unify specific kinds of education to solve practical problems that we clearly all recognize as existing. So, I mean, again, user manuals are an example, but it's not a trivial thing. Ditto propositions, ditto health insurance policies and so forth, which can often be unusable because you just can't make heads or tail out of the document that you've gotten. So.
I have a quick question for you. Given all these questions about what the best liberal arts education would be, regarding the U.S., do you see any other country or any culture doing it better than us, and what would you say they're doing better?
So I made a small comment that the liberal arts college is a distinctive formation of the United States and our political and educational culture. And that seems to be the case. That is, there are other systems that have an important emphasis on the humanities. In fact, I checked this question with my former advisor in Cambridge. I said, so, am I right to think, that liberal arts is what we Americans talk about, and you guys in Britain don't really talk about liberal arts? And he said, yes, you're right, we don't. We talk about the humanities. So why does that matter? I think it matters because in this country there has developed a very important idea of the relationship between this kind of education and freedom, which is different than an approach which connects this kind of education to cultivation, okay? Cultivation, which is partly what your question was about too, human cultivation, is certainly something that a liberal arts education does. But if that's the only thing you're paying attention to, then what you're oriented to is a very aristocratic approach to education and an aristocratic approach to leadership. And so there is a funny way in which what this country's done with liberal arts is to really say this is kind of an education that can be good for everybody and anybody in terms of cultivation, but also in terms of equipping them to be a member in a free polity. So I do actually, I'm starting to think that that very unusual idea in this country is part of what has kept our higher educational system stronger than elsewhere in the world. But it's true, as somebody alluded to, we have a crisis on our hands in the sense that K through 12 education is not doing terribly well. And you can't, over time, I don't think, continue to maintain successful education at the college and university level if you haven't strengthened K through 12. So I don't mean by any way to obscure the importance of the question about K through 12, and I do think it's a national question. I'm still just struggling with trying to understand what the right ways of entering the conversation about that are. So.
I'm sorry, I'm going to press the question about the canon again.
Sure.
Because I think that you are talking from the position of a utopia where you have a child of 16, 17, and 18 being exposed to exactly what that particular school will expose him or her to, and that child might never be even aware that there is something better out there. So you are under the impression when you say, no canon and no core curriculum and so on, that everybody has the innate capacity to say, gee, this is the liberal arts education, I want to have it because I want to be smart and I want to be da-da-da-da-da-da. And that doesn't happen without having something to be given to these children. Also, the undergraduate class who comes in, a child of 18, 19, and 20, as we know, their frontal lobes are not well developed until the age of 26, and that's well documented. So
That explains it.
Well, insurance companies know that.
You know, that's
Dependent.
right.
So the problem is that the question has to be approached from a general population point of view. And I can tell you, I'm a physician. When I give a public lecture, I have to give the lecture at the level of 6th and 7th grade, because otherwise I cannot communicate well. My particular, which goes back to the not textbook, but the user manual and what you said about reading the health insurance forms and so on. So utopia is beautiful, and we all want to have that, but without something to be given, this is what you have to do. Now, after that, of course, and I will make a parenthesis, all the children in a grammar school are told, are taught to be creative, without being given any substance. You cannot be creative until you don't have the knowledge, the fund of knowledge to be creative.
I take the point about my having a kind of utopian cast, because I think that's simply true, and I have to confess to it. But so I think we share a sense of where we'd like to be, but I think I'm trying to articulate some different ideas about how we might get there. So let me try to spell them out. And these are terrific questions. You guys are certainly pushing me, and so I am also thinking and learning in this conversation. These answers are not answers I've given before. So I realize that, of course, one of the things I loved most when I was a kid was getting summer reading lists every year at the end of school. So the question you're asking is, how do you get people started? You're willing to concede to me it's a wide open field once you get people into the conversation about liberal arts, but how do you get people in the first place? So summer reading lists were certainly part of what got me in, but there's an important difference between saying that and saying canon, right? Because I just used it in the plural. So the question is, what can you teach a person about the enterprise in the process of introducing them to it? So I would still make a distinction there between reading lists, plural, and changing over time, and a canon. So that's one thing. But then the other thing I'm realizing that I think, and explains why I'm active in a local fashion, is because so I buy one of the arguments of the Federalist Papers that one of the virtues of federalism is that it gives you an opportunity to experiment in different places. And if you can be successful in a small place, you can replicate that in other places, spread the message, essentially. And so in some sense, I guess, I'm still looking for a solution that depends on that notion of federalism, that allows for solutions to emerge in particular places, which can then be adopted in other places, rather than trying to find a solution that has to be imposed sort of top down.
I think using your parlance, this is the concept of federalism, and it is the opposite of the idiotic subsidiarity which has invaded the European community vocabulary, which is an oxymoron par excellence.
Right,
and
yeah.
It essentially caused a political crisis in the European Union, that it's still recovering.
Okay.
And exactly your point. It is because of language. You butcher the language, eventually you muddy the concept, and you end up with not knowing what happens. Until finally you get to nations, founding nations say no more.
Okay. Thank you. I hadn't thought of that as an example, so thank you.
Last question. Well, I may ask one then, if that's all right. It's actually not a question, so I'm going to challenge you again, press you on an assumption that you made.
Right.
Because it seems to me that you're assuming that there's a zero-sum game with cultural constraint on one side and individual autonomy on the other side, or replication on one side and liberation on the other. And I guess I'd challenge that and suggest that maybe they're independent, in fact, that you could have a high degree of constraint and a high degree of individual autonomy at the same time, or very low degrees of both at the same time. So my analogy would be in composing, let's say. So Bach was extremely constrained and yet give me 2 bars of anything he wrote and it's immediately recognizable as Bach, right? Whereas you take John Cage or anybody in that school, right, who tried to be very unconstrained and also extremely individual, and you can't tell any of them apart. They're all indistinguishably unique, so to speak. So my sense is that education, this is an important issue for education, right, that perhaps replication and liberation should go hand in hand. We want a culture that encourages liberation, and that's the sort of culture we want to replicate.
So I guess I partly need to push a bit a distinction I made. I probably didn't make it very emphatically, but I think there are 2 things in your question. At any rate, I regularly used the formulation that a person could then choose to preserve or to reject, right? So, in fact, the model that I articulated allowed for the choice of replication. That doesn't answer your deeper question about human autonomy, which relates to what it means to live with constraints. And I think there, what I would say is, you're right, but for you to be right, the relevant person has to know and understand their constraints. And that's the point I'm trying to make, right? That it's a matter of getting to a point of understanding them and then choose to accept them, work within them. There's plenty of room for autonomy, absolutely. Or not. Choose not to. There's also plenty of room for autonomy. And I think actually good forms of music in some of those alternative forms too.
Fair enough. Yeah, one last question. Anybody besides Jan, who's already asked several? By default, we'll go to, okay, Jan, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, if I can, I think this is actually very, very useful. I think, and I do not mean to put words in your mouth, but if I sense, I think your hesitation about replication is not replication per se, but rather a mindless, automatic, mandated, and rigidly enforced replication. Think about developmental models. You have, well, most of us have children, or anyway, know people who have children. You go through the rebellious adolescent state where essentially everything that mom and dad said is wrong and should be dismissed. Well, that is part of growing up. There is nothing wrong with that. However, how many of the adolescents emerge 90% plus completely on the opposite side of their parents' values? Not that many. Now, you still have a freedom. So, for example, faith, cultural beliefs, whatever they are, you rediscover them in your own set of values and semantic context, and they become yours. I believe it is the quest in such dimensions that we're talking about. Old is not necessarily good, but old is not to be jettisoned simply because it is old.
Yes.
So let's not fall into the other stereotype.
That's exactly right. And in fact, just to come back to the canon question for 2 seconds, because I'm sorry to have gotten so exercised about it. I think what I'm trying to get to there is that at the end of the day, the goal should be a personal canon. And so to the degree that the way we have for the last 20 years talked about canons, to the degree that that prevents people from developing a personal canon, I think it's problematic. Okay, so. Thank you.